Photography is an art with a lot of terminology, seemingly endless menu options, and a lot of equipment. Learning about photography can quickly feel overwhelming and confusing. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to simplify photography for you. I'm going to walk through the essential core basics that you need to know in order to get started in photography. Once you understand these basics, you will then have a solid foundation to hone and practice your skills with your camera of choice. Let's start that 15 minutes right now. When setting up your camera, there are 3 key settings that you need to understand and adjust on your camera. The first setting you should adjust on your camera is the ISO. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light, and this is represented by a numerical value. Lower values such as ISO 100 indicate less sensitivity to light, and higher values such as ISO 1600 indicate more sensitivity to light. Now, as a general rule, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible for the best quality photos. The reason for this is increasing the ISO will introduce what's called digital noise, and digital noise does not look good. And this ultimately ends up reducing the image quality. Now, how forgiving the ISO is will really depend on what camera you have. Some cameras you can go a lot higher with ISO and the quality will be great. Other cameras, once you get up to ISO 800, the quality will start to degrade pretty quickly. Generally, the larger the sensor you have in your camera, the higher you can go with your ISO. So if you have a full frame camera, generally you can go higher with your ISO than you can with an APS-C or a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And to demonstrate the effect that ISO has, check out this example photograph as I change the ISO from ISO 100 all the way up to ISO 25,600. And I'm using my Sony a7S III to show you these pictures. Now, when it comes to setting your ISO, the more light you have available, the lower you can go with your ISO. So if you're outdoors during the day in good daylight, you generally should be able to start off your ISO at ISO 100. If you're in the shade outside, then you'll probably need to set the ISO to about 200 or maybe 400. And if you're indoors doing a photograph, you'll probably need to start your ISO out at least 400 or 800. Once you've set your ISO, the second setting you'll want to adjust is the aperture. Now, the aperture is the opening in the camera lens that controls how much light gets through that lens to hit the camera's sensor. And this is measured in something called f-stops. And the important thing to know about f-stops is this is inversely related to the amount of light that's being let into the camera. So an f-stop of 2.8 is letting a lot more light into the camera than an f-stop of 16. And I'll show you a little demonstration here on this camera lens as I adjust the aperture from f2.8 to f16. You can see that opening there, it's nice and wide at 2.8, but as I move it down to f16, that opening gets smaller and smaller, which is less light being allowed into the camera. But ultimately, the reason that aperture matters is this controls your depth of field. And depth of field is how much area of your photograph is in focus. Smaller numbers, such as that f2.8, allow more light into the camera and result in a shallower, smaller depth of field. A shallower, smaller depth of field results in less area of the photo that's in focus. A bigger number, such as f16, means less light is getting into the camera, and this results in a longer, larger depth of field, which results in more area of your photo being in focus. So here are some examples of how you'd want to set the aperture depending on what your subject is. If you're shooting a photo with one subject, you can use a low f-stop value such as 2.8 or even lower depending on your lens. If you're shooting a photo with a group of people in it, you generally want to aim for an f-stop of about f4 to f5.6. And if you're doing a landscape photo, you'll want an f-stop of about f16 or maybe a little bit higher. So once you've keyed in your ISO and your aperture, the third setting you want to set is the shutter speed. Shutter speed simply refers to the amount of time that the camera shutter is open. This affects the amount of light that reaches the camera sensor when you push that button to take the photo. Shutter speed is measured in seconds, and many common values are measured in fractions of a second. The typical range of shutter speeds on most cameras is a shutter speed of 1/8000, which is 1/8000th of a second. That's really fast. All the way down to about 30 seconds, which means the shutter is literally open on the camera for 30 seconds. That shutter speed of 1/8000 is really fast, and the shutter speed of 30 seconds is really slow. Those faster shutter speeds that allow less light in are used to freeze motion, and they do it really well. The slower shutter speeds that allow more light to reach the sensor are used to create motion blur in your photo. How you set your shutter speed will depend on what type of photo you're taking. If you're taking a photo of still subjects, aim for a shutter speed of about 1/250 to about 1/500. This should generally ensure those subjects will be sharp. But if your subjects are moving, aim for a shutter speed of at least 1/800. And if you're shooting sports photography, you generally want to start off at least 1/800 and probably even faster for the shutter speed. And in case you're wondering what those slower shutter speeds are for, those are generally going to be for photographs where you want a waterfall or moving water or clouds to have a smooth motion blur in the photo. And generally these are going to be shutter speeds of about 1 second or higher. And those shutter speeds of 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds or more are generally going to be for nighttime astrophotography, when you want that shutter left nice and open so it can collect all of the details of the stars, the Milky Way, and the sky. So after you've dialed in the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, it's time to do a test photo and make sure these settings are going to work for your photo. So let's talk about what to do if your photo is too dark or too light. First of all, if your photo is too dark, you want to take the following steps in this order to fix it. The first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to slow down your shutter speed a bit, if possible, without getting unwanted motion blur. For example, if you're shooting a portrait of stationary subjects and you have your shutter speed set to 1/500, try adjusting that to 1/250. See if this brightens your image enough without adding unwanted motion blur. Using a tripod versus handheld will help you have a little bit more flexibility with that shutter speed. If adjusting the shutter speed a bit slower wasn't enough and your photo is still too dark, the next thing you'll want to adjust is the aperture. Now the flexibility you'll have with the aperture is going to depend on the type of scene you're shooting. If you're doing a landscape and you set it to something like f20, try setting it down to something like f16. And if you're shooting a picture with multiple subjects and you set the aperture to f5.6, try lowering this to f4. And if you're shooting a photo with a single subject, try lowering the aperture as far as possible, depending on what your lens will allow. And if your image is still too dark after adjusting the shutter speed and the aperture, you'll want to adjust the ISO, but you'll want to adjust the ISO as a last resort. So if your ISO was set to 100 and you're outside, try bumping it up to 200. If it's still not bright enough, bump it further until it is bright enough. After you've adjusted these settings, I recommend doing another test photo just to make sure you're all set. Now, if your photo's too bright, we want to take these steps in this order to fix that. First thing you want to do is you want to lower your ISO as far as possible. So let's say you're at ISO 400 and the image is too bright. Try lowering your ISO all the way down to 100 and confirm if that fixes it without making your image too dark. If it makes your image too dark, then try going back to about ISO 200. If you've lowered your ISO all the way down as far as it goes and your image is still too bright, the next step we'll want to take is adjusting the shutter speed higher. And of course, as long as this will not affect any motion blur that you want in your image. As an example, if you're shooting a portrait of multiple people and you have a shutter speed of 1/250, try setting that to 1/500 and see if that takes away the brightness. If it's still too bright, adjust your shutter speed to 1/800. If your image is still too bright after adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed, then the third step you'll want to take is adjusting your aperture to a higher f-stop value. Raising your aperture should be a last resort, but that's going to be the third setting to change to get your photo brightness where it needs to be. After you've made these three adjustments, I recommend taking another test photo just to make sure all is well. And a helpful tip here, if you want even more control over your aperture and shutter speed, especially if you're taking photos in the bright sunny outdoors, picking up an ND filter can be a great tool to add to your kit. ND stands for neutral density, and the ND filter reduces the amount of light coming into your camera by a uniform amount. Basically, an ND filter is sunglasses for your camera. And when you use these in bright sunny conditions, you can get a larger aperture, lower f-stop opening, and you can also have a slower shutter speed. To find the right ND filter for the camera lens that you're using, you'll need to look up your lens and look at the filter size for the lens. The filter size is generally going to be in millimeters. Once you've confirmed that, you can then look up ND filters of the size that you need, and then when you get that ND filter, it's going to attach to the outside of your lens. Most of them are going to be threaded, and you will be able to screw it on clockwise and unscrew it counterclockwise. And finally, speaking of camera lens, let's talk about camera lens basics and what you need to know to get the correct lens for your photography situation. Now, understanding the three fundamentals that I just went over, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, are important, but next in importance is having the correct lens for the photo you're trying to take. When you're looking at a lens for your camera, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure it's compatible with your camera. Once you've confirmed that, you'll want to confirm two main numbers on a camera lens. The first is the f-stop value of the lens, or the range of f-stop values. Some lenses have a single static f-stop value, and other ones have a range. The f-stop value of that lens will limit what f-stop values you can use when that lens is attached to your camera. The other number on your lens that will matter is the number or range of numbers in millimeters. Simply put, those millimeters are measuring the distance between your lens and your image sensor inside your camera when focused at infinity. The main reason this matters is this distance determines how much of the scene your lens on your camera can capture. This distance also determines how much something appears to be magnified compared to how the human eye sees it. Smaller lengths, such as 18 millimeters, are generally considered wide, and they capture a larger field of view. Larger lengths, such as 85 millimeters and higher, are generally considered narrow, and values above 85 millimeter are often considered telephoto. Some lenses have static focal lengths, other lenses have variable focal lengths. Most kit lenses that come with cameras typically have a variable focal length, and it's usually going to be in that 18 to 20 millimeters on the lower end, up to about 55 to 60, sometimes 70 on the upper end. So let's talk about what lens focal length you'll want for common photography situations. For landscape photography, a wider angle lens is great, such as 18 millimeters or 24 millimeters. For photography that feels most natural to the human eye, 50 millimeters is a great choice. For portrait photography, a focal length such as 85 millimeters or 100 millimeters is a great choice. And finally, if you want to do bird or animal photography or capture the moon, you'll want a telephoto lens of at least 200 millimeters for focal length. And that's because you want something that can get you closer to that bird or that animal without them running away. And with the moon is of course far away, and you want to get as close to the moon as you can to have that moon taking up as much of your frame as you want it to. So there you have it. These are the photography essentials that you need to know in order to understand the core fundamentals of photography. You're now equipped to start practicing, experimenting, and creating incredible art with your camera. If you have questions or want to learn more about an aspect of photography that I maybe didn't cover in this video, definitely leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to know what you would like to learn more about. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a like. I really appreciate it, and that helps me a whole lot.